Andrew, there seems to be a lot of talk and excitement around the gut microbiome. I mean, nowadays, like, they're saying that the gut is literally in charge of so much of what's happening inside our body. And I guess in the area of kind of aging, longevity medicine, can you share some insight into the latest research? What are your thoughts on how the gut responds to longevity?
So the microbiome, this is actually the hallmark of aging that I added while I was writing my book, because it wasn't in the original 2013 paper, but it was in an updated hallmarks of aging paper that came out last year. So you heard it here first. It was in my book before it was in the scientific literature.
Love it.
The microbiome, so biome is just the name that scientists give for the organisms that live in a particular place. Micro, obviously very small. And we think there are we know there are loads of bacteria living all over us, all inside us. So your skin has a microbiome, your mouth has an oral microbiome, but perhaps the most studied and maybe the most important is the microbiome inside your gut. And this is mainly found in your intestines. These are bacteria that effectively live off the food that you eat. And they have a variety of different functions. And they seem to be, one of the reasons we think they're super important is just because there are so many of them. So there are about sort of 30 or 40 trillion cells in your body. So that's 30 or 40 followed by 12 zeros. It's a really big number. We think there are about the same number of bacteria in your gut as there are cells in your body. So they're clearly a really important component part. Sorry, you're going to say something. That's the reason
I was going to out myself as an absolutely uneducated person, I'll say. And so that means that bacteria must be much smaller than cells, right?
They are, yeah, exactly. So that's definitely the logic you've got to go with there. It makes sense.
Yeah, you've outed me there, Andrew. I was hoping that you'd skate over that little look that I made.
Yes, obviously bacteria are a lot smaller, but these huge numbers of microorganisms are clearly doing something, right? They're clearly in there. They're not just passengers inside your human body. We know that they're responsible for breaking down some of the things in food that you can't break down, so they can provide chemicals to your body. They're responsible in part for suppressing pathogenic bacteria. So if you get food poisoning, one of the ways that food poisoning is overcome is your gut microbiome fighting back against it, trying to reestablish normality. And we also know that they communicate with your immune system. Now, you might think this is slightly weird because your immune system normally tries to kill bacteria, tries to remove the threat. But actually, your gut microbiome and your immune system have this sort of collaborative relationship. And it seems to be really, really important for maintaining immune health as well. So what happens when we age? We know that as you get older or as you get certain chronic diseases, things like diabetes, what you can find is that the diversity of your microbiome goes down. And so that means that more aggressive species tend to become dominant and you get fewer, so you get a lesser variety sort of is what's going on. Now, the real question, and this is still an outstanding question in the field, I would say, is which direction does the causality go? So is it the fact that your microbiome is decreasing in diversity that's driving some aspects of your aging? Or is it because you're aging, perhaps because your immune system is getting weaker, all these various things are going on, the linings of your guts, the properties of those change as you age as well. Maybe that's what drives the changes in the microbiome. And actually, this being biology, I suspect the answer is probably a bit of both. So what gives us any confidence that this might be somewhere where we could intervene that might have a causative effect on the aging process? I think the most fascinating experiments were done in an animal called a killy fish. Now, this is not a normal lab organism. Obviously, a lot of people think of lab rats, lab mice, that sort of thing. A killy fish is a new model organism that's primarily used at the moment for aging research. And the reason is they have a very short lifespan. So these are fish that are found in what are called ephemeral pools in Africa. And what an ephemeral pool means, obviously, is one that's not around for very long. So the eggs are laid in the mud, essentially. And when the rainy season comes around, the rain falls on these things, it fills up these ephemeral pools, and the fish, the clock is ticking because they've got to hatch from the egg, they've got to grow up, they've got to find a mate, they've got to mate with that mate, they've got to lay some more eggs before the pool disappears. And that means that they've got a very short lifespan. They've got a very short life cycle. And if you have them in the lab, they tend to live about 4 months. So that's obviously much, much shorter than a human, but it's also much shorter than a mouse. Mice, as I said, live 2 or 3 years.
Which means that you can get through more research
exactly
to go.
Because if you're going to research aging, you want an animal that doesn't take, if we're going to do a gut microbiome experiment on humans, we're going to be sitting around for 80 years, absolute nightmare. So you want to do some sort of proof of concept in something that lives a bit shorter. So what they did was they got some of these killy fish, they grew them up in the lab, and they waited until they're about 2 months old, which doesn't sound very old, but that's sort of middle age if you're a killy fish. And then they gave them this really potent course of antibiotics, which basically wiped out their whole gut microbiome. And so they've got an empty gut. And then they did one of two things. They reinfused those microbes, but they either gave them the microbiome of a middle-aged fish, so essentially they cleaned it out for a couple of days and then gave them the same microbes back, or they gave them the microbiome from a younger fish. And what they found was that those killy fish, the middle-aged ones who'd had this infusion from the younger fish, they lived longer. They lived about a month longer, actually, which, when you only live 4 months, living 5 is actually rather impressive. And they also found, obviously it's hard to check for sort of the frailty and cognitive performance in a tiny little fish, but they saw that they darted around the tank more, which they thought was sort of, an indicator of delayed frailty. Again, these aren't dragging out the sort of the frail part at the end of life. It seems to be keeping them healthier for longer. And so this is a really interesting piece of causal evidence that suggests that if you manipulate the microbiome, you can also manipulate the aging process. So obviously more work still needs to be done, but that's such an exciting result. I hope we can scale up to mice, scale up to humans, and start to understand a bit more about what's going on.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I read actually in Dr. Will Bolshevik's book, Fiber Field, where he's also a gut microbiome expert. He was talking about this experiment where they'd done a similar thing to mice, where they wiped out their gut microbiome, and then these would be like obese mice, and they implanted the gut microbiome of a healthier weight person, mice, and then the obese mice was like losing weight really rapidly. So it's really interesting. But going back to the relationship between the immune system and the gut microbiome, autophagy seems to be the buzzword when it comes to kind of longevity. So many people, in the functional medicine space are, talking about intermittent fasting protocols, reversing disease in that way. But also there's not that much research around whether intermittent fasting is actually working in the way that we assume it is. What are your thoughts around this? How would you sort of say we should stimulate autophagy? Are there any drugs that are in development for it? What are your thoughts?
So it really does seem to be an important process when it comes to aging. And this is actually another one of the hallmarks of aging, is the accumulation of damaged proteins. So, we often think of protein as the thing you see on the side of a label when you're looking at the food. You've got the protein, the fat, the sugar, all these sorts of things. But actually, that sort of does protein a disservice. It's not just some block of nutrient. It's actually one of the most, proteins are the fundamental molecular workers. They're like nanobots that are inside our bodies doing all of the tasks inside our cells. They're also fundamental to the structure of our bodies. So things like collagen, we've already mentioned, that's a crucial structural protein, not just in your skin, but also your bones, your blood vessels. There are loads of places where it essentially holds your body together. So these are really, really important molecules. And those ones that are inside our cells actually are recycled very, very often. So they typically only last for a few days before getting gobbled up in this process called autophagy, and then recycled into new proteins, sort of fresh ones that haven't been damaged anymore. And the problem is that as we get older, this process of autophagy can get less and less efficient. And so one of the ideas is that if we can boost that autophagy, maybe we can improve the lifespan and the health span of animals and hopefully, of course, of human beings. And the reason that we originally started thinking about this were some experiments that happened a surprisingly long time ago. So this was back in the 1930s. There were some experiments done with rats looking at something called calorie restriction. And the idea was that you fed the rats substantially less. This isn't just a diet. This is like eating 40% less for their whole lives, but being really careful to make sure that while they were eating less, they were still getting all the vitamins, the minerals, sort of micronutrients that they needed. And this is sometimes called calorie restriction with optimal nutrition, or CRON. And what they found was that the rats that were eating far less than their compatriots who could eat what they liked, they lived a lot longer. And again, as is sort of my recurring theme here, they weren't just dragging out the frailty, they lived healthier for longer as well. So when they did a little tiny sort of rat autopsy at the end of the experiment, they found that the rats had died of very much the same things as their sort of litter mates who could eat what they wanted, just they'd lived 50% longer still. So that's a really exciting result. And it was hypothesized.
50%?
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
Do you think that that's transferable to human beings? In your opinion, and of course we don't have any evidence of that
Unfortunately,
yet.
Probably not. And the reason is that there's the effects vary in size hugely. So you can make a nematode worm, a tiny little sort of millimeter long worm, live, I think, 300% longer with calorie restriction. Mice, I think you can get about 50%.
Is there a correlation to the size of the organism?
Maybe. When
the complexity of the body?
Yeah, we're
perhaps?
not entirely sure. So it might be that there's a correlation, unfortunately, with lifespan. So, for example, one of the hypotheses as to why this calorie restriction effect happens is, imagine you're an animal out in the wild and there's a famine. What you need to do is you don't want to have kids during that famine, right? Because if you have kids, they're going to grow up in this world where there's not enough food. They're probably all going to die. You're not going to pass on your genes. You've put all this energy into creating these kids. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. And so the idea is that maybe you hunker down, you sort of reduce your aging speed, for example. That would mean that you can survive for longer. You can maybe live out the famine, then have kids, in the next season when the food's a bit more plentiful. And if you're a rat or a mouse and you only live, 1, 2, 3 years, then that could be a really big deal. If you have a famine for one season, that's a really important thing. And So you need to extend your lifespan in order to wait out that famine. But imagine now you're a human and you live, maybe 60 years if you survived your childhood, of course, as we just discussed. Then it's not so important. It's not such a huge fraction of your reproductive lifespan. So maybe for that reason, it's not as evolutionarily significant. We've done experiments in monkeys, which are about as close as we've got to people. And what we found is that, to cut a very long story short, that it seems as though if you eat a roughly healthy diet, then by the time you then add calorie restriction on top of that, it doesn't seem to be anything like such a large effect. There's enough in those monkey experiments to keep calorie restriction nerds debating for months. So I won't go into the full details of that, but it seems as though it gets... Maybe it's something to do with size, maybe it's something to do with complexity, maybe it's just an evolutionary thing depending on how long you live. It does appear to get less effective as you get to the scale of humans. That said, we have got some human evidence, which is there was a study called Calorie. It's an acronym for something completely tortured that I've now forgotten, but it's a classic science thing where they try and make the sort of what it stands for fit the word. And they tried this for 2 years in humans, and they found, firstly, it's just incredibly hard to stick to. But those people who were able to stick to it, they cut back their diet by about 12% in calories this time. And they did seem to get healthier over that period of time. So they did loads of blood tests on them. And by and large, those things went in the right direction. The only trouble is, not those side effects. Not only are you hungry all the time, people reported that, you might think you get used to it. You might think the hunger goes away. That doesn't unfortunately seem to happen. There are also other side effects as well. So they report feeling cold all the time. It can have an impact on your sex drive, which might be a good thing for some people, but, obviously depends on your preferences. They also had a couple of people who dropped out of the study because their blood got very thin. So they got this problem called anemia. Some people's bones thinned. This was just a small number of people. But again, you sort of maybe want to be doing this under medical supervision. It's not, maybe don't try this at home. So that's the evidence that we've got for calorie restriction. The challenge with fasting is that we've got less evidence still. There's some argument that maybe some of the results that we've seen in calorie restriction experiments actually are sort of fasting by the back door. And the reason for that is, imagine you're a mouse. So mice are nocturnal, and that means obviously they're active during the night. And if you're doing this experiment on calorie restriction on mice in the lab, unfortunately, PhD students, who are the ones who normally feed the mice, are diurnal, i.e. active during the day. So the way this feeding normally happens, the mice that are allowed to eat what they like, they obviously just have a big pile of food. It's there all the time. There's nothing to worry about. But the mice who are on the calorie restriction, what happens is the PhD student goes in at the end of their work day, which is the beginning of the mouse active period, the mouse night. And so what you do is you put in your amount of food that the calorie restricted mice are allowed to eat. Now these mice, they wake up, they're calorie restricted, they are starving. And so what are they going to do? They're going to chow down on all that food. Maybe they eat it in the first hour. That means they then fast for 23 hours. And if you're a mouse...
Oh, so it's not a good enough experiment because humans, if we were going to fast and have calorie restriction, we would still probably adhere to a breakfast, lunch and dinner and spread that energy intake out.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's the question. And to what extent is it that concentrating the calories in that single period of time, is it the calorie restriction itself that's causing it, or is it the timing of the eating? And if you think about a 23-hour fast for a mouse, if you or I didn't eat, we'd probably survive about 3 weeks. But if a mouse doesn't eat, it only survives about 3 days. It's obviously much smaller. It's got a much faster metabolism. So a 23-hour fast is like it's like you or me fasting for a week or something. So that's hardcore, I think is the word.
Yeah.
So it's really not obvious how you transfer these results to humans. There have been some studies on intermittent fasting. One of the ones that was looking at weight loss. Actually, so my wife and I started trying something called time-restricted feeding, which is, so there are a load of different protocols. Time-restricted feeding is the one where you try and only eat for a 6 or an 8 hour window during the day. And this is actually super easy to do. As a student, I would often skip breakfast. And so it's quite easy. You imagine, you have your first meal at noon, at lunchtime, then you eat, make sure you finish your evening meal by 8 p.m. That's not too challenging. That's pretty doable for a lot of people. And we were actually doing this for about a week. We're thinking, this is fine. This is going quite well. But literally at the end of that week, a study came out where I was looking at using this for weight loss. And what they'd found was that people who did this, they got some slightly overweight people, they gave them either time-restricted feeding or just a sort of regular diet, quote unquote. And they found that the people who'd done the time-restricted feeding, they did lose weight, but they seemed to lose more muscle mass than fat mass, which is a bad thing. When you're losing weight, you'd ideally lose fat and maintain that lean muscle mass, which we know is really important, for your general health and for how you age. And so it's, that convinced us to stop, actually. So we did it for 1 week, then that study came out, and then it was straight back. Yeah, exactly. Good timing, hey. So we just need more human studies, frankly. There's something interesting going on here. The ideal scenario, I think, for me would be to not have to worry about what I eat, but have a drug that mimics the effect of calorie restriction. And so to go back to autophagy, which was how this question began, there's obviously a lot to talk about on this topic. If you do one of these calorie restriction experiments on mice, but you remove a gene that is essential for autophagy, what you find is that the calorie restriction doesn't work anymore. And so clearly from that experiment, you think that autophagy has something to do with the effects of calorie restriction. And so the idea is that we could give a drug that would enhance autophagy and hopefully allow animals to live longer and healthier. And actually that drug I already mentioned is a drug called rapamycin. That is one of the best autophagy enhancing drugs. What we really need to do is get that from, we've demonstrated that it can extend mouse lifespan, keep mice healthier for longer in loads of different conditions. It's one of the most reliable life extending drugs in mice. It also works, by the way, in loads of other organisms, which isn't always the case. So it works in yeast, which is the single celled fungus we use for brewing beer and making bread. It works in these nematode worms I mentioned. It works in fruit flies. It's really like surprisingly universal.